Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Wilton Benitez Anaerobic Wash Processed Colombia from Verb Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Verb, based out of Boulder, Colorado. And they were a suggestion to us by Gavin Chair. So shout out to and thank you to Gavin for the suggestion. This is Verb's second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed the Guitar site, a wash process Rwandan coffee that far exceeded my expectations. And while purchasing that coffee, I was deciding which Wilton Benitez coffee we were going to purchase as well, between this one, which is a pink Bourbon, and they also had a Chirroso Wilton Benitez coffee. And I tried that Chirroso in-store in person, and I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of that one, mostly because it did skew a fair bit on the more citric side of things. So I figured that we would at least review this one, as it also sounded pretty interesting. Now, for anybody that's wondering, I am quite familiar with Wilton Benitez's coffees. Although we have not reviewed one on this channel, I've actually tried a number of samples of them in the past. So I do have a pretty good idea of what I am in for with this one. And that's one of the main reasons why I wanted to purchase and review this coffee, given that we have somehow never reviewed any of Wilton Benitez's coffees on this channel. It also gives us an opportunity to review a non-wash processed coffee from Verb. So for all of those reasons, it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 38. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, only 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, definitely a little bit more tricky to tell when it comes to this one, given the processing. Even then, I can still tell that it is on the lighter side of coffee roasters relative to a lot of the other ones we have had in Colorado. So I would still say on the lighter side of that medium light in terms of that roast profile. With all of that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we ran it through the V60, and the cup had such a strong passion fruit aroma in the whole beans and the brew itself, with it being a very strong contributing factor to the cup itself, unsurprisingly whatsoever, as there was an extremely intense and sweet experience that was reminiscent of the Diego Bermudez Tropical that we had had from Archetype in the past, but with a slight bit more clarity, as that one offered relatively little clarity. This one right here was surprisingly well defined, as it didn't necessarily have too much of the funkiness that you might expect given what this coffee is. Strong passion fruit ice cream is the best way I could describe it, with a very long-lasting sugar intensity to it. Unique starts, though, once again, I was kind of expecting this sort of thing going into this one. Day 17 through the Chemex, and the cup is somehow even more wild and intense, with a passion fruit ice cream being as strong and pronounced as possible. Extremely lively coffee with such a strong sugary sweetness and a only slight bit of funk as of this point. The listed cotton candy also felt apt, as the entirety of the coffee just feels like sugar sweet intensity right from the onset. So yeah, as of this moment, it's been in line with the expectation. It's been in line with a lot of the notes we will trek on. Was on day 20, we opted for the April brewer, and this is the first time the coffee reached a point of instability, as the brightness just kind of skewed in a direction that didn't necessarily go with the rest of the coffee. A little bit too heavily as well, and there's not quite as much definition to the rest of the coffee. A slight bit more funk is also present, as it's still relatively well defined in the sugary passion fruit ice cream like sweetness, but the rest of it just kind of seems to go a little bit more in directions that weren't quite as defined or clear. Less impressive on this day. We continue on to day 23, as we opted for the V60 with the same recipe, and it was back to being at its best. So consistency on the V60, on the other brew methods, maybe a little less so, as it had an extremely sweet fruit-forward cup once again, as the listed passion fruit will continue to remain the most dominant aspect, with a strong tropicality to the cup. Always fully expected in that sense. Listed caramel now feels a little bit more apt, with a wild cotton candy level of sugary sweetness that is also very intense. I mean, just think of this coffee as basically being a candy store. It's a sugar bomb, but specifically a lot of those really strong tropical components to it. Day 26 through the Chemex and opted for a slightly lower temperature as it's a little bit better. It's still super intense and it continues to dominate the cup, but there was a little bit more funkiness through this brew method, which is something that I had kind of anticipated. I just wanted to give it a second try through the Chemex, and that definitely seemed to yield a lot of the expected results. The passion fruit intensity continues to remain very strong with a strong abundance of sugary sweetness, and I decided let's stick with the V60 going forward. I've experienced consistency with that brew method as on day 29. It continues to remain very straightforward, and I feel like from this point going forward, a lot of the notes are going to be mostly repetitive as it really dominates the cup. The very strong tropical intensity just continues to dominate it. Extremely sweet in terms of the tropicality, sweeter citrus, as well as some stone fruit too. A very ripe pineapple and mango are also felt within this one. Continue on to day 32, back through the V60. Similar experience as it offers a near artificial level of tropicality. Plenty of the sugary candy sweetness, once again in line with the listed cotton candy as it's so sugary forward. And somebody described this to me one time with the Pepe Hontaxator from Manhattan once upon a time. They said that the way it kind of dissolves makes it feel like there's a cotton candy sort of sugariness to it. I could kind of see that, but a little bit more that it just has a very sugar forward aspect to it. Day 35 final notes we have, and I ran out of space for the notes, but the cup is finally starting to lose a little bit of its stability and structure. Here on day 38, it's also starting to lose a little bit more of it as there's a bit more funkiness and a little less clarity in general, but that will take us actually right now to the tasting wheel. So let's see what we're getting. And we have 4 level 5s. That might be a record, but yeah, 4 level 5s. Let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the finish, level 5. That's unsurprising. This coffee is one of those coffees that lingers forever. It's one of those coffees that once you brew it, you can actually smell it for a couple of additional hours as it just leaves a very lingering, long-lasting intensity to it in the aroma, in the cup, and in your palate as well. So this one right here is one of those coffees where you're like, this is just so long-lasting that you're going to be tasting it for quite a bit, as I'm going to be tasting that sip for quite a bit. Sweetness. Level 5, and this is one of those coffees where you could say it's all the way up there like a level 7. This is a relative tasting wheel, and the sweetness to this one is so sugary and so intense that it's literally off the charts when it comes to trying to chart it on a tasting wheel. Ridiculously intense, ridiculously sweet, though, I mean, we'll discuss that a little bit more when we get to the cleanliness of it. Berry fruit, level 5. So passion fruit is technically a berry. That's where the berry attribute of this one comes in. But yeah, that one again, it's a relative tasting wheel. It's off the charts. You could push this up to a level 6. I've never had a passion fruit quite as intense as this experience was right here. Right at the onset, something that was ever present, something that continued to remain in the cup, and it will continue to remain probably as long as this coffee still exists. Citrus fruit, level 5, and I briefly mentioned that there was that kind of pineapple attribute to it as well. I don't think that they have any additional citric components listed on here, but yeah, I was kind of surprised as how much citric brightness there was within this coffee, and I was experiencing that kind of contrary to the overall tropicality because you're getting it in a very sweet and sugary sense, and you're also getting it in a very citric sense, so all of it just extremely sweet, and that's why you see a second level 5 in terms of those fruit profiles. Then we have a couple of level 4s. We'll start with the acidity level 4. As I kind of mentioned, I was surprised at just how much brightness there was to this coffee. At times it was a little unstable as I could see it being a level 5 on certain days where I said it's just skewing very wildly in a direction that I feel like isn't quite right or natural for the way that this coffee is supposed to be, but significantly higher than expected on this one. Stone fruit, level 4. As mentioned, it reminded me a little bit of the Diego Bermudez Tropical that we'd had in the past, and that one had a little bit of the kind of more funky, fermenty stone fruit attribute to it. While it may not have necessarily been as fermenty or even as intense in that sense, it still was present enough to the point where it scored that level 4, but it offered enough of a defined profile with a lack of the processing to it that it reached that level 4. Caramel, level 4. Honestly, that is one of the more subtle components to it. It's funny that it's one of the notes listed on here because the rest of the coffee is so intense that when you're picking up a caramel that for most other coffees would be the more dominant factor to it, you're like, oh, it's there. It's just a little bit more subtle in the background relative to all of the other sugary experiences, all of the other fruit experiences you have in this one. But even then, it's intense too. So that's just kind of a scale as to how intense the rest of this coffee is. And then We'll briefly touch the body, medium bodied. I don't think there's really too much to add to that. The most important thing to discuss about this coffee is the clarity, the cleanliness at that level 4. And I feel like that's going to come as a huge surprise to everybody. And the only thing I have to say about that is it's defined. Like, the passion fruit on there is defined. It lacks the funkiness. It lacks the fermentiness that you would expect for a coffee that's this processed. So I had no other place to put it other than that level 4, because I said, I've had way too many other coffees that don't have this level of clarity that this one has. So it justifies that level 4 at the very least for the sugary definition, or at the very least the passion fruit definition that it has. And it's void of the kind of undesirable processed characteristics that you'd experience from a coffee like this. So it ends up at that level 4, and I know it makes me uncomfortable to put it there, but that's the honest reality of what I got from it. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I'm not going to get controversial. I'm not going to get political about this coffee. I know a lot of people have a lot of strong opinions about Wilton Benitez and his coffees, and whatever this coffee is, let me just say this. If there's anything additional that's happened to this coffee, or if there's anything that it's just normal, this is the way that this coffee turned out, whatever the case is, I think this is about as well done as I've experienced from a coffee like this, mostly because it did not have the undesirable characteristics to it. Now, it is losing a little bit of its stability, and it may not have necessarily always been an overly consistent coffee, but at the end of the day, I said, it's not quite as overbearing and undesirable as the vast majority of coffees I've had like this in the past have been. So credit to Verb, at least in that regard, as I think they did a very good job of making this coffee hold a little bit more of its stability. Some of the other Wilton Benitez coffees I've had have had much more inconsistency than this one did. So make of that what you will. I still think it's fine. These coffees are never my type of coffee. I do want, while it still had that level of clarity, I don't want something this intense that may not necessarily be a super clean coffee. So while it was on the cleaner side of things, I think it was probably still just a little bit too intense for me in general. Wilton Benitez coffees in general are a little too intense for me. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you've enjoyed his coffees in the past, then I can't help but point you in the direction of this one, especially if you do enjoy the passion fruit characteristic of coffee in general, because this one, it's just present. You don't need to be an expert in tasting coffee. You don't need to have tasted coffee for a lot of your life to just experience a lot of the attributes that are present within this one. They're right there in your face. They're prominent, they're pronounced, they're sweet, they're lingering, they're long lasting. You're going to get them in abundance, and it'll be a very easy cup of coffee to drink. And if you don't get too tired by that very intense profile, then it's something that you can enjoy. But honestly, I think that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Wilton Benitez Anaerobic Wash Processed Colombia from Verb Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.